you are now about to be presented how you can achieve governance in your organization through transformative migration. And I'll explain what that means in a minute. Who am I? I am Brad. And I've done a lot of different things in my career. I had to shorten this bullet a few times, but it brought to mind the old adage that, humans are generalists by nature, specialization is for insects. So I've done a lot of different things. The stuff that I'm particularly proud of is the mentorship work in the community around a lot of different topics. It started as mentoring people on how to program software, writing code in C#, ASP.NET 1.1, and it grew into educating people on how to use SharePoint and the reasons why that's important. And then it grew into educating people on how to create a SharePoint business. And then it grew into how to keep your business running for longer than a few days, weeks, months, years. And then it turned into mentoring organizations on how to engage with businesses in a useful way. So that kind of educational background. I work for BAE Systems. It's a little company. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. And most particularly, my background is one of the United States Marine Corps. And I use that as a warning because there are times when the Marine surfaces. I try to keep them down. But if I do that and I say anything that is not as politically correct as you would prefer, just call me out on it. I have a thick skin. It's okay. Just say, don't say that, Brad. I will correct myself. And my background is primarily in government, and it bleeds into regulated industries for the obvious reasons that the governments regulate those industries. So what I'm going to go over today, I'm going to set the stage for what we're going to talk about. And that's important because I'm sure that you guys have had a number of different people in a number of different colored suits stand in front of you in a number of different rooms telling you what governance is, or telling you what migration is. Perhaps not. There's a lot of misconception about what migration means, what governance means. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to set the stage. I'm going to baseline those definitions for what I am positing it means in the perspective of what we're going to talk about today. And then we're going to talk about what transformative migration is, other than a buzzword added to a very general term, and at least what I think it is. And then we're going to talk about what I'm giving you to help you do this. I have given numerous governance presentations, numerous. And not everybody that comes to the presentation is able to solve the problem. And in these business tracks, in this business track, which, oh, by the way, do you appreciate how Steve gave us our own floor for the business track? The whole floor is ours. We're that important. I'm going to make an attempt to make sure that you guys have artifacts that you can use to accelerate or enable what I'm talking about in this presentation. So if you really want to try doing this, that I'm going to share with you some artifacts and some items that you're going to be able to use to start moving in that path. So I'll go over that in detail. What is governance? It's a road. That's an analogy that I use because in this road anyway, it doesn't ever stop. More specifically, it's about control, not features, not technology. Governance is about control. There's a number of different entities involved in an information technology system, right? What do we have? We have users, we have systems, we have computers, we have servers, we have services, we have vendors. There's roles and scopes, and they overlap and they interact, and they could be one thing, they could also be something different. And it's not about control, it's not about the technology. That's only one part of the governance construct. It's about controlling how those different entities interact in a predictable and compliant way. And compliance is defined by what your governance targets are. It's not some overarching, well, you're compliant. If you're compliant, there isn't one level of compliance. It's you're compliant is whenever you're compliant with the policies that you're currently holding or you're being held accountable to provide against. And if you hear anything different about, well, I can sell you governance, or I have this software that if you pay me, £50 or you pay me £50,000 or £50 million, then you'll have governance after you're done paying me, after the check clears. You're being sold. And at its most basic level, more than anything, technology and science has a tendency to react in a predictable and logical manner. Humans do not. So the riskiest part of a governed construct is the humans. It's about how to control the human beings that are involved in that, whether they're administrators, decision makers, users. And it's a road. It means that it's never ending, always going. As long as you're moving, then you're alive. And as long as you're alive, you need governance because you need to stay on the road. Now, what is migration? So the first thing we talked about, what is governance? Baselining what I think governance is for the nature of this presentation. What is migration? Well, more particularly, what isn't migration? Migration is a very overused word that a lot of different people use in order to sell you on whatever services they're currently offering. And the one thing that it isn't, that a lot of people use as the definition for migration, is an upgrade. If you're just upgrading SharePoint from SharePoint 2007 to 2010, from 2010 to 2013, from 2013 to 2016, that's not a migration. Nothing's moving, nothing's changing. You're just buying into Microsoft's line of business of you need these new features and that's why you need to upgrade. We have a new version and that's why you need to buy it. Migration actually is one of two general categories, right? We're talking about a platform or a transformative. A platform migration is when you're talking about pulling data out. You're extracting databases, you're extracting data constructs, and you're moving them to a new place, a new location, a new farm, moving it from on-premises or into the cloud, or from the cloud, Azure or AWS or whatever, into 365. A transformative migration is when you choose to restructure the information that is in those data sets as part of the migration process. Now, migrations are disruptive. We all talk about that, right? SharePoint is a disruptive technology. That means that it's changing. There's change. It's injecting change into your organization. It's adding tasks. It's removing tasks. It's changing the process. It's changing how people communicate. It's changing where they go, where they click, what they see. So it's disruptive as a technology because it's changing things. A migration is an opportunity, right? If you're doing this, then you have the opportunity to do this because you're already driving disruption. The users already know, already expecting things to change. They're already expecting their interface to change. They're already expecting the technology to change, the way that they interact with it to change. And so there's an opportunity, a window, where you can layer another level of disruption on top of that, which is governance. When you're trying to impress control onto a complex system like an intranet or an extranet or an internet or all three, or a particular application, a functional application, if you're trying to take control and apply it to those entities, you want to do it in the least disruptive way possible. If you already have expected disruption, then migration becomes, instead of a total cost point, an opportunity to lay a governance model on top of it. So, the other reason I asked you if you've been in my previous sessions is that because I only have 60 minutes to go through this, I don't have the ability to go through and lead you into building the governance plan. At this point, I'm going to assume that you have one. You all have one, right? And if you don't, you can go to YouTube and Google Governance 101 and see me yell at you for 60 minutes about how to develop your own governance plan. But At its high level, when I say governance plan, I'm saying that you have the policies and controls defined that you want to impress upon your system. You have the roles and responsibilities defined. And I'm not going to kill that dead horse once more with the governance board. Governance is about people. Sustaining governance is about having the structures, the communication structures in place to sustain it. If you don't have a governance board, you do not have a governance plan. Or whatever you call it. You don't need to call it a governance board, but effectively it is the same thing. It's a group of people who are responsible, who are held accountable, and have the authority to impress and maintain control of the IT system that you're talking about. And it has process definitions, everything from this is the process that we follow to create a new site. This is the process we follow to create a new application. This is a process we follow to dispose of a record. This is a process of, all the processes that are part of your organization that are going to be governed. And information architecture. Now, that right there is where I have a tendency to go what a lot of people, in different floors of this building would say off the reservation. Information architecture is an intrinsic and required part of governance. Does anybody dispute that statement? The reason why is that you don't have targeting for your controls unless you know what the hell you're actually attaching it to. The governance for a record is going to be different for the governance of a non-record. The controls you apply are going to be different. The security for a document is going to differ between a document that doesn't have personally identifiable information and a document that does have personally identifiable information. How do you tell the difference? Does SharePoint intrinsically know? No. You install SharePoint, it knows there's documents, and there's tasks, and there's announcements. The default content types and metadata structures for SharePoint are the most useless thing your organization could ever use as its standard. You have to establish an information architecture so that SharePoint knows what something is, that workflow is attached to that type of document, that process kicks off when that task gets updated. So unless you have an information architecture as part of your governance plan, you don't have any way to target the controls that you're defining in it. The policies target content, not all content, specific content for that particular policy. And the requirements traceability matrix. Everybody knows what that is, right? You should all know what that is. You need a requirements traceability matrix for any project that you end up implementing, because you don't need to just understand the requirements of the project at the beginning. You need a history. You need a living representation of how those requirements shift, change, add, remove, become, overcome, obsolete, or split, merged over the course of the project. And the traceability matrix is a tool that allows you to do that. It's PMBOK. How many PMPs do we have in here? Anyone? PMPs? We have at least one. So he is managing this project for us. So you should have that. The requirements traceability matrix is how we're going to track the requirements for this migration. What are our outcomes? What are our objectives? Why are we doing it? So, the transformative migration process. The prerequisites. Your assessment and planning have already been done at a high level because you have a governance plan, correct? We have a governance plan. We have an initial RTM. We understand what our data storage capacities are. We understand what infrastructure we have available. These are things that we're not solving in this session. Once you have these components in place, you understand your organization, you understand what you're trying to accomplish, and the governance plan that you need implemented. Because writing the plan doesn't mean it's in place. You just know this is where you want to be. Now we're going to take those and we're going to get there. The actual migration process is a three-stage process of build, migrate, and verify. Now, if we have any developers in here, I'm not going to get into a semantic argument about the word build. The word build means a lot of different things, and I am overloading the term in this scenario, but what we're talking about building here is we're building our migration. So, In the build, we're provisioning services, systems, platforms. We're getting the environment ready that doesn't exist, the environment that we're moving to. We're configuring technologies needed in order to be able to execute, as well as configuring the data map. We'll talk about that. And we're integrating the different technologies together that we need to use. Migration tools, for instance. We need to get those implemented before the migration happens. That's what's happening in this stage. We're setting up the environments to travel, for the data and transformation process to travel through. And then we're going to go through the migration, and we'll talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about how you need to do a prototype migration, why it's important to do a prototype migration, the difference between a prototype and the iterative transforms and baseline transforms that actually happen during the migration, and why you should always be able to iterate in any IT system, including a migration. Who here has participated in a migration by either your choice or by no choice, participated in a migration that where you come in one day and you see one thing, and then you come in the next day and it's just something different. And if they built it, it will come, right? Anyone? Anyone see that? Anyone have that experience? It doesn't work very well. It's not very pleasant for anybody. So iteration is important. And then, of course, the verification, we'll talk about that in pretty much detail. We'll talk about incremental updates, the difference between incremental transforms and incremental updates of content, the reasons why they're different, the importance of communication in migration. Communicating with the users is important. And, of course, sustainment. I'm not going to talk about sustainment in any real degree other than the fact that it needs to happen, that you can't just stop here. Congratulations, you have a new SharePoint, or whatever. Notice you haven't seen many SharePoint words up here, right? The word SharePoint doesn't show up. I have a secret to share with you at the end of the presentation, but I'll get to that. And just the importance of the existence of a sustainment strategy. You must sustain the system in order for it to have relevance and use and value for an organization. I know that sounds like common sense, but you'd be surprised. So, and the importance of adoption. Adoption is not an instant process. Everybody goes to the same training class, everybody's good, right? Everybody's fine. No, adoption is just like governance, an ongoing process. And in fact, surprisingly enough, most of the governance plans that I deliver include adoption in them, because the manner and with which users adopt technology is something that I want to govern. The policies that they get educated on, the processes, the information architecture they become familiar with. But again, that's not this presentation, that's something for the future. Transformative migration, measurement. Who here was in my ROI presentation 5 years ago? Anyone? Well, I did an ROI presentation 5 years ago, which was an interesting presentation because a lot of people don't think about that when they should, is the understanding of if I'm going to spend millions of dollars, and don't get me wrong, we're talking about millions of dollars. You're talking about an organization that has 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 users distributed across 3 different countries, 8 different countries, 4 different continents, what have you. There's millions of dollars. If you're going to spend that millions of dollars, somebody at some point is going to stand up and ask the question, what did we get for that? And so the argument of why are we doing this, or more importantly, being able to go back and prove that this migration truly was transformative. A transformative migration is measured by the adoption of the user. Not just everybody that's logging in, how many people are using my sites, how many people have loaded the home page, which if you're embedding it in the browser makes it really easy to get that metric really inflated up there. That is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the measured adoption of the processes defined in governance, right? How many people are creating sites? How many people are disposing records? How many people are, blah, blah, blah. Whatever the processes are that you have in there, you measure the success of a migration based on those features being adopted, the adoption level of those processes, those functions. Measurement is important. So let's go into some detail. So for the build stage, what happens in the build stage? We have critical path, and we have the outputs of the stage. So does everybody know what a critical path is, right? The critical path is the items that must happen in that sequence in order for this stage to complete successfully. Right, so it's if you're looking at a project plan, right, the critical path is an extract from that project plan that's just representative of the milestones that must be met in this sequence or milestones start slipping. So, build new platform. In order to be able to migrate anything, you have to build new platform. You have to have some place that you're moving it to. In this case, let's imagine a SharePoint 2013 farm. You have SharePoint 2010, 2007, 2003, whatever version you have, or some other technology, and you're migrating into SharePoint 2010. The first step is you have to build the platform. Notice I'm not saying build an intranet, build a site topology. We're not talking about that. That's not what we're constructing yet. We're talking about building the services that the farm that's responsible for hosting whatever it is we're migrating into it, whether it's an intranet, extranet, internet, what have you. And of course, we're at a SharePoint conference, and I'm consolidating the dozens of other presentations about how to construct a farm according to best practices into a single bullet. They can teach you how to do that, but that must be done in order to be able to start what I am about to show you. So then you have to construct a content map. And I have tools to help you do that. This mapping existing environment into new environment defined by new governance model. If you're overlaying a governance plan and the governance plan contains information architecture, you already have a document that tells you what you want your new environment to look like. You already know. But you have to be able to map what you have now to what you want it to be. And I have some tools to help you do that. So in this stage, that's where we're building the content map. We are building the point A and point B construct. In order to get from point A to point B, we need to know where we are and where we want to go, and that will help us define the map and the direction that we want to move in. And then we communicate to users any requirement updates that need to happen during that transformation. Because again, we're talking about using an RTM, not an FRD, not a functional requirements document, but an RTM, a traceability matrix that shows us these are the requirements, these are the features they map to, these are the changes that are happening to this requirement over the course of this process. The outputs are a content map. Now, the easiest content map to understand is simply an Excel spreadsheet. And you can create it by hand. If you're talking about doing a transformative migration for an office or for a business or an entity that has 100 users, you probably don't need to go through the exercise of creating a SQL database to map those relationships. However, if you're talking about an organization like, say, FEMA or the United States Marine Corps, a couple of them that I have some familiarity with, those organizations, we create a content map database for, and we use that to automate some of this process. You don't have to automate a transformative migration. You can do it by hand. But it's really a question of scale to determine whether or not you want to automate it or not. Is there anybody here representing organizations or customers of less than 1,000 users? So in your cases, you'll probably want to manage this process manually. The ROI for actually spending the time to create the mapping database would be too high or too difficult to achieve. Ed, volume of content is also important. But it's surprisingly, from a migration perspective, it's less important because, again, the biggest crux, and I'm kind of leading off. I'm getting further into my presentation earlier, but the difficulty in migration is not about moving data. It's not about how fast you copy information. It's not about how much data you have to migrate. It's about moving your users and changing their behavior. That's the hard part. So much of the, I completely understand, and in certain circumstances, if you're talking about migrating like a functional application that has extremely complex data structures, then in that case, that's probably going to be correct. But most of the time, the complexity and the difficulty comes from the number of users you're migrating. So, and you'll see that when we talk about these other products, right? So then there are 3 other outputs from this process. 2 artifacts that you haven't seen before, and of course an update to the requirements traceability matrix. Anything that we learn while we're mapping this information that needs to update the requirements themselves. The first is called a current environment specification. Does anybody have a guess as to what that defines? That is point A. That is where we are. That is a report, an analysis, a map, a specification of where we are today. So if we're talking about SharePoint, what are we going to have? This is going to have a site topology list. It's going to have all the sites and all the structures with all the permissions extracted for all the different elements inside our existing farm, the one that we're migrating from. That's the current environment specification. And I have a template for you to use for that, and I'll introduce that to you later. The second is the end state specification. That is the end as point B. That's the specification of where we want to go. And the end state specification is when is the CES compliant with the governance plan that we have? No. Because the governance plan is what we're trying to implement as part of this migration. The CES is what we have right now. Assume ungoverned, right? Uncontrolled. The end state specification is what it's going to look like when we have control of the environment, when we have governance has been implemented. So that's the build stage. What happens next? We have those things. What do we do with them? Now, I think I already talked about that. Yeah. We actually do the migration. So the first step is a prototype migration. Why is prototyping important? Prototyping is important because oftentimes, especially when it comes to SharePoint or anything complex in information technology, until you see it, all of your assumptions may change, right? You have to see it. Not only that, how many users do you guys have that have an absolute 100% accurate, perfect vision of everything that they should have in their IT application before you deliver it to them? That doesn't exist. That user does not exist. So, prototyping is extremely important. So we have, right now, remember from the previous build, we have the current environment specification, which is, this is what we have right now. And we have the end state specification. This is what we're going to have when we're done. And we have a map to show how to move a document, a piece of content, a user, from point A to point B. Because we know point A and point B. The map is surprisingly easy to develop once you know point A and point B. So, we need to show them what it's going to look like. Typically speaking, the way that we handled this in our application, in our migrations, because again, that is large information. It's a large amount of data. We only migrate the first 10 to 15% of content, and we limit it that. So the top 15%, we show them the initial topologies, right? So the site collections get created, the top level sites get created. You end up getting like 2 or 3 sites deep, and then it stops. So that we can show them an idea of what this new construct, this new data construct, this new governance construct is going to look like in the new environment, so they're not surprised. Let me go off on a little bit of a tangent here. Surprise is bad. Always. Now, some people would argue that good surprise, being surprised in a positive way, is good. I would say, no, it's not. IT should be boring. The delivery of systems like this should be dull and mind-numbing. It should be. Do you know why? Because mind-numbing means no risk. Surprise, whether it's good or bad, is a representation of risk. They're surprised because they thought something else was going to happen. In my experience, and again, boring, mind-numbing, I have been working with the U.S. federal government for my entire career, so that might be biasing some of my perspective. But that mind-numbingly predictable outcome is why you continue to get paid and why there's never any argument about why you shouldn't continue to get paid, either as a vendor, or you should continue to get your budget to keep SharePoint running, or you should be able to continue to get the investment needed in order to, run that application. Those mind-numbing predictable outcomes are representing the reduction of risk to a level that is acceptable for business decision-making. So, the prototype allows you to begin to mitigate and remove the risk that surprise of your user base and audiences poses. And you get it out to as many people as you can. So, we had point A, point B, we have a mapping database, we run a migration. We stop at a certain point, we solicit feedback, we get it back, and we tweak the CES, or not the CES, we tweak the ESS and the map. We tweak it based on that feedback, and then we start iterative migrations. The prototype is a milestone, which is, congratulations, we have a new SharePoint site, start looking at it. And then we start iterating. And the iterations are baseline migrations. This is a full migration of the entire environment. So these could be a big iteration. For instance, the last one of these we did was for FEMA. They had about 1.5 terabytes in an intranet web application that we were pulling over. Actually, we were pulling 3 and merging them into one intranet because they had 3 different intranets. An example of governance if I've ever seen one. And we consolidated that, migrated it over, and it took about 6 days for the migration process to run. It's not about data copying, remember? We were transforming that data as it moved from point A to point B. That wasn't a bunch of people sitting there and hacking on that information either. That was running an automated tool set. I believe that we used Metalogic's content matrix for that customer. We used AvePoint, what the hell is the name of their migration tool? Anybody know? I forgot it. We used the AvePoint migration tool prior to that. Most migration tools, Tsunami Migrator, we've used that before. It's not about the migration tool. Each of them have their quirks and their variances, but in the end, most of them are really only doing the easy part of the migration. DocAv. Most of those tools are doing the easy part. That's why they can build a product that's repeatable over and over again. They focus on the easy part of the migration, which is once you have a map, we're going to do a copy for you. And it's a really special copy, and we're going to put it in those special places, but it's the same thing every time. They all do the same thing. The difficulty is building the map and the process that you use to define how your migration should transform your data. So these iterations could take a while. If you're talking about terabytes of information, it could be a week or 2 each time you iterate. You run that process, you kick it off, it builds a new baseline intranet, and then you bring it out, and you solicit feedback again. And you bring it out, and you solicit feedback again, and you should do this as many times as you possibly can before you run out of management backing for doing another one. Because every time you do that, you're going to get more information. Now, we're talking about a migration, right? This isn't a product development cycle. So there isn't a Q&A period. This, for migration, is your Q&A period. Every time you do the baseline migration, every time you pull everything over, you tweak, you've run it with a new tweaked map, every time you do that, you drive more testing and quality control. And you're putting the agency back on the user base as to whether or not they're getting what they need. Every time you do that, it's less likely that anybody's going to have the political ability to come back and say, well, we're not getting what we want. Well, why didn't you say that when you approved this previous iteration of the baseline? You want to remove that argument. Again, boring. You want the last migration to be dull. And everybody's like, oh, well, finally it's done. We don't have to worry about that anymore. So, after you've done a number of iterations, again, it could be as many times as you need, then you do a final baseline migration. Now, it's not the final migration, it's the final baseline migration. That means at that point, all of the content that was in the old system is now represented in the new one after processing through the map. The outputs from this stage are the prototype. Yay, exciting, we have a prototype. Start getting validation. The final ESS, because that is finalized after you do the final iteration. Every time you do this, you update the ESS. Every time you do it, you update it again. And after you're done with that, you have a final end state that's documented as this is where we're ending up. This is the governed environment. And then we have multiple iterative migration environments. They're not duplicative, they're just overriding it each time. And then the final baseline. So those are the outputs that occur in this stage.
What is ESS?
The end state specification. We spoke about that here. That's the output from the previous phase. Oh, and I have a template. I know it's something that you guys haven't seen before. This is not a PEMBOT construct, but I have a template I will give you so you can use it.
Sorry, Bradley. Why
Yeah.
is the requirements traceability matrix not in
In the next stage, in the migrate stage, it could be, it can be. The requirements traceability, the difference between the requirements traceability matrix and the end states and one of the specifications is the level of specificity that goes into what you're talking about, right? What you the understanding of a requirement, right, which is mapping to a specific use case you want to support, right? We want our users to be able to use my sites. We want our users to be able to upload documents with PII. We want a record of this particular classification to dispose itself after 3 years or 3 months or 3 days or whatever. Those use cases mapped to those requirements, you really should have those refined and completed by the end of the build stage. Because here, we need those stabilized in order to iterate through the updates to the ESS, which is going to we have 400,000 sites, and the site map is changing. We're going to tweak this, we're going to tweak that. These sites are going to collapse, these sites are going to split out, these people are going to be assigned to those. But a site by site you should not have your sites defined as requirements. We all know that, right? It's like if you have 400,000 sites, you should not have 400,000 requirements with each requirement being that we have a requirement for this site, and we have site A, site B, site C. That's not a requirement. Functional requirements. Functional. I see you laughing, and you're laughing because I find it just as amusing because you've seen that. You've seen requirements documents that had it site by site. Like one site is a requirement and the other one is as well. The requirement for sites should exist. That's not the same thing. Right. So there's a variance, and the RTM really should be done by then. But like everything, this is flexibility. The goal is to have a predictable outcome. So if there's something that's learned in here that requires an update to the RTM, can you update the RTM? Absolutely, you should update the RTM. Just be careful. We don't want this scope to go on infinitely. So the last stage that I'm going to talk about, where'd my mouse go? The last stage we're going to talk about is the verify stage. So, one would think that there's been some verification up to this point, and you're correct, because we have been verifying. We've been prototyping, we've been iterating, we've been communicating with the customers. They've had a chance to look at it and interact with it. But this verification is much larger. It's a much larger verification, scope-wise, of the entire governance construct. So when we're talking about verify, we're not talking about verifying that the content migrated successfully. We're verifying that the policies and controls that we're implementing have been implemented correctly. Verification of governance. So, at this point, we're setting the permissions and policies on baselines. Why is this the soonest that we could possibly do this? The soonest part that you could possibly assign a policy or a permission set to an object in a SharePoint farm is this stage. Because up until this point, when the final baseline migration is done, it's possible that the objects don't all exist. Right? The sites, when you're migrating to a new farm, a new environment, it's creating the sites each time. It's creating site collections, it's creating site trees, it's creating lists and libraries. It's creating entities in a SharePoint repository that represent those content structures and those tools that you use. And you can't set permissions on something that doesn't exist. So you cannot actually assign permissions and policies to the web applications or to the site collections or to the elements inside, the entities inside the structures, until the structures actually exist. So the first thing you do in the verification stage is extract those from the governance and the requirements and assign them to the objects. Then you execute incremental content updates, because as soon as you set these permissions and policies, they're going to be tested. People are going to be looking at them. Remember, the baseline has happened, which means the users have access to this. And not all the users, whatever your stakeholder groups are. And those communication channels are looking at that. Why would you need to do an incremental content update? And what's the difference between an incremental migration? So, a migration is building site structure. It's building content structure. So every time you do a migration, new sites are being created. In whatever format, it's extracting the information and mapping it to the new environment. Once those sites exist, those lists exist, those libraries exist, you have this map that shows you exactly where everything is in your new environment. And what if you don't kick over right then? You shouldn't. There's still work that needs to be done. But what happens when the old system has changes that are being made to documents, to lists and libraries? People are adding content, they're removing it, they're editing that content. If there's a time delay of any significant degree between when the baseline happens and when the cutover to the new system, when everybody's told this is your new intranet and you must update here, not here, then there's going to have to be a content update. But that's good, that's fine, we understand that, and I have good news. You have a map that tells you exactly where everything is. And so all you need to do is run an incremental content update, which, at least with Content Matrix, Metalogic's Content Matrix, they were able to differentiate between the previous run and the current run and only move over deltas, right? New documents added, changes to documents. And so we were able to do incremental refreshes. We didn't have to do the cutover right when the baseline finished. We could give it some time to test the permissions, to go through marketing and training and make sure the organization was ready to move. Make sure that they were bored out of their minds when it came time to cut over. They just wanted it to be done. God, we know everything. Stop explaining this, Brad.
Bradley,
Yeah.
how would you adopt, what impact would this approach have if you've got, say, a large organisation with multiple business units, and you couldn't assess every business unit, you have to do it incrementally, so therefore you might have to retrospectively go back and modify the ones.
I have an answer for you,
Good.
and we'll get to that. So, we're incrementally updating content now, not structure. The structure is part of the baseline migration. The migration iterations, we're updating the structure. Now that the structure is locked, we're updating content if there's a gap between when we cut over to the new environment and changes being made in the old one. And then we do a final user audience migration. What is that? What is the final user audience migration? It is an announcement that says, you're migrated. If you follow the process this way, then what happens is everything's already been moved, the permissions have already been set, the governance policies and controls are already in place, it's already been tested, everybody's already seen it, you've already got all the appropriate documentation signed. The final user migration is, let's put a fork in this roast because it's done. And you just make that decision and it cuts over with an announcement. The outputs of this stage are the initial assignments for controls, permissions, policies, processes, workflows, etc. The incremental content updates, however many are needed until you've done the last one and you're ready to do the cutover. And of course, that cutover announcement, should happen immediately following an incremental content update. You always want to end the last content update with the announcement that you're using the new system. Any changes you have in the old system are no longer going to be moved. Or they're going to be user-driven, right? If you edit the document here, you're going to have to download it to your desktop and upload it in the new space. But you've announced it. Communication. This is giving you the tools to communicate with your users. And then, of course, the final user audience migration. Why do I call this an audience? I don't know. I have an answer for you, and I'm about to give it to you. So I'm going to give you a project plan. How do you break a large organization that might have a lot of data in different audiences and a lot of different areas, different regions? Your organization is either functionally or organizationally broken up into discrete chunks that need to be managed inside those scopes. It would be too massive to migrate everybody. Well, this plan is designed to be not only to be able to iterate across the entire process, but also to iterate within audiences. And so what we call them inside this process is audiences. So the transformative migration task starts on item number 2. Remember, we have one bar up on the new SharePoint implementation. Congratulations. We've consolidated all of that stuff, all the technical gobbledygook, into one line. You have a new SharePoint farm. Now what do? We start doing audience migration. So audience 1 is representative of the first user audience. And then audience N is created for every other audience in your organization that needs to be migrated. These are peers. These aren't subordinates. These are things that are happening at the same time. Or they could happen at the same time after you've assigned resources and leveled the project. So, as an example, again, we'll use FEMA as an example again. So FEMA went through this migration. Does everybody know what FEMA is? Yeah. Anybody that's watched the news in the United States in the last 10 years has heard somebody complaining about FEMA. That's the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and they're a particularly challenged organization. We'll just leave it at that. But what just happened? Did I just lose my... Stop it. All right. We had 10 migration audiences, and they corresponded with the they call them components, the components of FEMA. There's response, and there's recovery, and there's FIMA, and then there's policies and plans, and there's the office of the administrator. So they had an organizational chart. They took that chart and they built the scopes for that out for each audience, and then in the project plan we created a number of audiences equal to the number of components that they were running. And so for each component we were doing the structure updates. Each component had their own CES, each component had their own ESS, each component had their own incremental updates of baseline, each component had their own iterative content refreshes. And you manage it inside that space because SharePoint is a lovely product to be able to build those kinds of structural separations. You have site collections. Each component ends up with a site collection. Each branch ends up with a branch of that site collection. We have these things that we can define and manage those scopes for. So we were able to break those up. And then, for our perspective, they wanted to be able to run them in 2 stages of parallelization. So there were 10 components, and they resourced the project so they could run 5 at a time. So there were 5 different audiences being migrated, and then as soon as those 5 were done, 5 more then got migrated, and then they were done. Yes, that does mean that there is a gap between the initial group of migrations, the audiences that migrate, and when the final migration announcement happens. Is that a problem for us, though? No, because we have incremental content updates. We finish them to the point where we know their end state is done. We finish them to the point where we just update the content changes that they're making in the system until the rest of the migrations are complete. And then we cut everybody over. In fact, for 2 of the audiences, because they had some political importance and were able to yell at people until they got with their way, they were using their sites well ahead of the rest of the organization. But that wasn't really an issue because they had their own site collections. So they were able to go in and use the intranet, the new intranet, well before other people, and nobody was going to argue because they had all the political backing and control the budget. I wasn't going to argue with them. And then I want to point out a couple of, just a couple more items on this artifact. Whoa. Come on. Where's my Gantt chart? Show me the Gantt. Oh, I hate you, project. Okay, that's a good enough view. So, audience migrations. They are starting first, right? We're going to the audiences. We're kicking off the migration. We're doing a pre-migration survey. You should do a pre-migration survey. For the stakeholders, you're identifying the people that are going to be participating in the migration on behalf of that organization, that audience. You're doing all of these things, right? We're generating the current environment specification. We're generating the end state specification for this audience. We're doing this for all the audiences at the beginning of the project, right? But then, audience-specific work stops. And what happens? We do the things for everything. We conduct the preparatory migration. The prototype is for everybody. Once we have all the CESs and ESSs in, we do the prototype for the whole organization. And they all get a chance to input. And then we do the baseline migration. That's why it's called a baseline. The baseline is for the whole new environment. It baselines the whole new construct that you're moving to, the governed system. But it's not done yet. And then as soon as the baseline is done, we start iterating through the audiences again. And so the audiences get re-engaged at that point, and the incremental content updates for the audiences begin. So if you're from a project management perspective, this section of the project is the part that resource loading will allow you to make parallel, right? However many people you have doing it determines how many audiences you can migrate at the same time. That will be the functional determination about how long it takes to do this process in total. Resource loading here is going to have a much slower impact. You're not going to be able to parallelize these tasks. These are things that must happen in this order. You can shrink them by adding resources, but there is a diminishing returns with any technical, project where, eventually, no matter how many people you throw at it, it's still going to go that long. So this is the first artifact. You can have a copy of it. Email me, email Steve, email Zoe, or wait for the DVD. It will be on the DVD. But again, it's still going to take several weeks for that to arrive for everybody. So the second artifact I want to show you, in the few seconds I have left, is the template for the current environment specification. Okay, so you're going to get this Excel template, and it has a lot of columns on it. There's a key for it, and the tabs at the bottom. So when you get the template, you can look at it and you can see how they're keyed. But the blue sections are the ones that are system sections. They're not editable, and we protect those cells in the spreadsheet so that people can't change them, right? And then the green section are things that people can change. Now, the only time you need a green section for the current environment specification, right? We're trying to figure out where the sites are right now. We're trying to figure out where the content is right now. The only reason you need a green one is if you're doing this manually. If you're doing this manually, that means that this is a data call. You're sending it out to the people in the audiences that you're breaking up and saying, hey, list your sites. There's the opportunity for human error, obviously. If you build a mapping database, however, you can extract this information from SharePoint programmatically, just by doing an analysis, a scrub of the databases. There are tools that there's numerous tools that you can use to extract the structure, the site structure, list structure, library structure of a SharePoint repository. This is not a sales pitch for those tools. If you want to use those, that's great. This format is what you should be extracting them into. And you put that information into the columns, and this becomes point A. This is what you can feed into the map to generate your new environment. The second artifact, and yes, you will also get a copy of this. The second one that I want to show you is the end state specification template, which is going to look very similar. Nope, that is not what I'm doing. with some important changes. So the end state specification is, in all cases, going to be a user editable document because we need to send it out, solicit feedback from the stakeholders, and get them to input any changes or updates that they need to the environment they're going to. However, we want to control that. And so the important difference here is that in this template there are fields. So things like Boolean switches, yes, no questions, the selection of an organization. Let me switch over to that tab and I'll show you that. These are generics, obviously, but the department or the audiences, these are examples, right, of the drop-downs you have in there. But the drop-downs you should have for specifying where something ends up should align to your governance model, your information architecture that we've been talking about. You take these settings here as examples and you put the parts that are specific for your information architecture and your governance plan in those selections, and you force them to select from those drop-downs. You don't give them the ability to hand jam in where they think their site should be. But you do need to drive agency out to the users for the participation and ownership of their own migration. All right. I only have a few minutes. I have no minutes left. But I'm going to steal a few anyway, and if they yell at me, I don't care. Next, next, next. What happens next? What was that, Paul? Oh. I am not the Brad I used to be. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. What happens next? Ongoing training and adoption investment. Personally, I think this is the single biggest failure for most organizations when it comes to SharePoint, and about 70 to 75% of SharePoint investments fail initially. So, if you're having trouble with your SharePoint environment, it's almost always going to be tracked back to an issue around training or adoption sustainment, with some few exceptions. I'm not going to sit here and talk about SLAs and OLAs, because we all know that every system in IT should have SLAs and OLAs, right? Ones that make sense and map to the business mission of your organization. If you don't have them, you're wrong. And the continued enhancement. So use the map. Once you do this migration process, these tools are useful. You not only have a document that defines where you came from, but you also have a map for everything where you are right now. Keep it updated. Use it as a mechanism to drive future enhancement and enable your organization to get more out of the tool. Want to know a secret? This is not a SharePoint transformative migration model. This is a transformative migration model, a non-platform oriented one. Do I have anybody from Microsoft in the audience? If I did, I didn't care anyway. This process is less about the technology and more about how you communicate with your users, how you organize the team that is responsible for not only moving to a new technology, a new solution, but also overlaying a new governance model, using it as an opportunity to do that. This process has been used for a migration from SharePoint 2007 to 2010, a migration from SharePoint 2003 to 2013, and a migration from SharePoint 2007 to Oracle Portal. So it has been used. These artifacts are extracted and scrubbed representations of things that have actually been done, projects that have actually happened, to the tunes of years of effort and millions of dollars, and they succeeded. Yeah.
If you choose not to migrate all of the existing content,
Then all you do is don't put it in the ESS. If you don't want it to be in the new system, don't put it in the new ESS.
yeah, I appreciate that, but then what do you do about access to it, or taking your
Now that in and of itself, yeah. So yeah, the specifically the ideas of how to manage an aging or archiving repository for SharePoint is a thorny issue that's starting to crop up more and more as the SharePoint repositories age. Being able to archive SharePoint in a records retention scenario, which I'm guessing is that's what you're talking about, right? You have business data. Just because you're not moving it, just because it doesn't need to be used, just because the new governance doesn't allow the users to even access that information, that doesn't mean it doesn't need to be retained or disposed of appropriately according to policies. That's a records management challenge, unfortunately. And I can talk to you about that offline. There are other sessions that are happening on Wednesday. Yeah, so go to Paul Turner's session on Wednesday. What's the title, Paul?
I think it's just a generic information architecture management one.
Yep.
It's in here, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the bad boys already get this.
Retention, records, and compliance is a huge issue in the SharePoint market space right now. It's a huge issue, and I'm sure that most of you know that already. I don't need to tell you that. There are solutions for it. I'm out of time and I don't have the chance to go through it, but I can talk about it, Paul can talk about it, and John Holliday can also talk about it, but John unfortunately is not speaking at this show this year. But you can reach out to him at john@johnholliday.net and he will answer questions about records. He wrote the book on records management in SharePoint and can talk about how you can extract and archive and retain information out of that. Well, thank you for coming. And thank you for putting up with it.